good evening. A very warm welcome to Platform Talks. My name's Emily Bertla. I'm the curator of the series. I'm really thrilled to be here. Before we start, I wanted to acknowledge that Platform Talks at Art Toronto takes place on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, and it is now the home of many diverse First Nations, including Inuit and Métis people. As a newcomer to Canada, I wish to contribute to truth and reconciliation, and I understand that one of its first steps is a process of learning or relearning. And I hope that the Platform Talks program is a chance to learn together, to reflect on the challenges in the socio-political landscape, and to discuss how we can build a more resilient and representative art world together. And to that effect, I'm really thrilled that we have three amazing speakers with us tonight. We're going to hear from two organizational leaders, Ebony Haynes, who's the director and curator of 52 Walker, David Zwirner in New York, and Bernard Doucet, who's the director of the Sobey Art Foundation. They have been revisiting institutional and philanthropic models, and will be in discussion with Hadani Ditmars, correspondent from the art newspaper. We'll have a chance to have some questions at the end of the talk. And before I hand over to our speakers, please do join me in giving them a very warm round of applause and enjoy the discussion.
Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Angela, can you hear me at the back? Yes. Okay, good. Well, I'm going to be brave and try and do this without my glasses, but I've got them just here in case, if you know what I mean. I'll start off by introducing the panelists. We have, to my left, to my immediate left, the lovely and talented Bernard Doucet. He's a dynamic and internationally recognized philanthropy and arts administrator who believes that the visual arts provide boundless opportunities for the foundation of human and community connections. As executive director of the Sobey Art Foundation, Bernard has been a central figure in the evolution of the contemporary Canadian art ecosystem for the past decade. He occupies a singular professional position at the intersection of partnership building with public institutions, cultural philanthropy and funding, the national and international promotion of practicing Canadian artists, and the associated engagement of art and mainstream media across Canada and around the world. How do you have time to sleep?
I know, it's busy.
He is known for his collaborative approach to creating new avenues for Canadian artists and institutions to reach broader audiences with stable funding models. I want to hear about those. He is the incoming director and CEO of the Beaverbrook Art Gallery in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and will assume those duties on December 1st of this year.
Congratulations.
Yay. That's an amazing bio. And I read it without my glasses, so. And Ebony L. Haynes, at the far end of the stage, is a writer and curator from Toronto. Yay. She is presently based in New York, where she's a senior director at David Zwirner and leads the gallery's 52 Walker space in Tribeca. Haynes sits on the boards of Artist Space in New York and the New Art Dealers Alliance. She also runs Black Art Sessions, an online school that offers free professional practice classes to Black students worldwide. So I'm going to put on the glasses. The squinting isn't worth it. There we go. So, and who am I? I mean, the art newspaper correspondent thing is a bit of a cover, really. I'm a writer who's been documenting arts and culture in the Middle East, specifically Iraq and Palestine, for 3 decades. I wrote a book on pre- and post-invasion culture in Iraq called Dancing in the No-Fly Zone, and I'm working at the moment on a new book called Between Two Rivers about ancient sites and contemporary culture. Now, in Iraq and Palestine, there's this terrible phenomenon of art increasing in value exponentially in direct relationship to the level of destruction of the artist's homeland. I'm not sure that will ever happen here, but who knows? Let's wait and see what happens after the next election or next elections. But there are some instructive examples of the issue of public or versus private funding. Especially in Iraq, you have this model of a strong state-funded culture that was attached to a police state in the 80s and 90s. but not so much in the 70s. That devolved into chaos post-invasion, and now thanks to an American-led crackdown on money laundering in Iraq, there are billions of dirty petrol dollars going into new art galleries. So the private-public funding issue transcends the Canadian experience. Just to give you one example. So let's dive right into this one, Bernard. In many ways, vis-a-vis your new role as director of Beaverbrook, the gallery is kind of a hybrid model, right? In terms of public and private funding.
The institution is a legacy institution that was left by a benefactor. It operates through private funding as well as some government grants, but it's a unique entity in Canada because it's not an extension of a government department.
Right, yeah. So that has advantages.
Very much so, yes.
And what would they be?
I think, one, the ability to really work with the legacy of the donor who left the property to the public good, but also the flexibility to really take risks that will chart a journey on going forward that differentiate us from other sorts of institutions.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so because I think in Canada there's often just an assumption that the arts are going to be federally and provincially funded. But I'd like to get Ebony's take on the sort of public-private model. And I know we had a chat earlier about the perils and pitfalls of public versus private funding and the artist as capitalist. So I wonder if you would speak to the model you created at 52 Walker.
Sure. Also, hello, Toronto. This is not a scripted talk. That's not how I like to talk. So I hope everybody's paying attention and will ask questions later. I'm feeling very relaxed in Toronto. Can everyone hear? There's no monitor up here, so Bernard and I were just saying it sounds like we're not projecting. Great.
Sound is good, okay.
New models. Yes. Well, 52 Walker is a new model in that it, conceptualization forms by me, which has been over a decade really, it stems from my experience in the art world, proposed to blend a commercial art gallery in a traditional form in that it represents artists and sells work and has an art fairs where we are here, but also to blend it with a institutional model, and I used the European model of a Kunsthalle as opposed to a museum, so like a non-collecting institution, but with everything else that models itself to a museum, so longer exhibitions, usually publications, a curator. Galleries don't have curators, but I will die on a cross that gallery directors are like curators. I'm not a gallery director like that anymore, but they're not just salespeople, right? Love to the gallery directors. They work with artists closely, but I really trained as a curator and an art critic, and after 10 years in a commercial gallery, I was already dabbling on both sides of this coin. I was working with artists I didn't represent, writing texts, curating shows internationally, and I was also representing artists and doing art fairs, and I really liked the freedom I was afforded, or what felt like a different kind of freedom as a curator in a space that didn't represent artists, but the selling aspect and producing work and being able to have the funding and the support, financial support was important. I don't really like the bureaucracy personally. I'm speaking very candidly. I love museums. I'm here for them and artist-run spaces. We all need them. I think this is an interesting talk that we should think about the possibility of new models. I'm not proposing a paradigm shift, but I personally wanted faster movement. So this 52 Walker is those things. It's a non-representing, non-collecting institution, also non-representing gallery. I only do 4 shows a year. Every show gets a book. I don't do art fairs, but I love art fairs. I do think they're an important part of the ecology, that's true, but I don't personally do them, and I don't represent artists, and I sell all of the work.
Mm-hmm. So in our discussion earlier, we were talking about the artist as capitalist and the whole sort of albatross of public funding, or it can be an albatross. But, as a writer, I have to say that most of us, as a Canadian writer, most of us could not live without Canada Council grants. But is that as true in the visual arts world? And if not, does that make you less beholden to sort of confining ideas about Canadian content or building a national visual arts culture?
Well, I think that the Canada Council has an underlying hand in the entire sector. I've worked with private funders for the past decade plus, so my experience has been very different. Our experience at the Sobey Art Foundation has really been about working with professionals as a foundation. With a board. We are very declarative that we are not the curatorial experts. So for 22 years now, our experience has been with enabling representatives of institutions to help support the ecology of the country. And Hadani, just before I proceed, there's one person in the room who I'm going to put on the spot and ask to stand for a round of applause. Because June Clark, I hope you don't mind, June.
June, we love you, June.
There's June.
June is the 2024 Ontario Shortlisted Artist for this year's Sobey Art Award.
And her work is just out here.
And I had the privilege of curating and working with June at this year's MoCA Toronto Triennial. Love June.
And we are humbled to be able to be associated with June through her work at this year's award.
So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Ebony, just in terms of this.
Probably not anything as interesting as Bernard, but I do love the Canada Council. I think it's speaking as somebody who's crossed over the pond for over a decade now, it's a system of funding and support that is quite unique, and I think I took for granted when I was here. When my first 3 years in New York, I also received Canada Council grants still, so they really support Canadian art world things. And it was, my first writing award was for C Magazine, and Canada Council gave me some money to travel for my first review, and I was living in New York. It was just a very transparent, and I'm not sure if it's the same way now. Am I going to get in trouble for that? Someone's looking at me like, oh. I was honest about where I was living. I didn't do it deceptively. I felt like it was a very transparent and easy process as well. Again, it's been over a decade, so I'm not sure what it's like now. But nothing that accessible, in my experience, exists in my New York world. It all feels very bureaucratic. Not to say there's not bureaucracy with the Canada Council grants, but it felt like in my own experience, a very generous institution.
So when we were having our chat the other week, we were talking about how important it is, you both agreed that the artist should be seen as a capitalist, as someone who deserves a living wage, not someone who's just getting, or perceived as getting, like, government handouts and that kind of thing. And I wonder if you could speak to that model of change.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. How many people in the room are practicing artists who earn their living through their practice? And how many of you are tired
Wait, just want to say, everybody who's raised their hand first, after you qualified it, they were like, I guess I'm living off of it.
But how many of you have noticed that we talk about a living wage for artists and not a fair wage for artists like we do in literally every other sector, whether it's the trades, the sciences, business, accountants, pick one, I don't know. So this notion of a living wage is like sort of the first great big problem, in my opinion.
Right.
The Sobey Art Award, was designed to really do more than just award financially to exceptional artists. It was designed to really give a stronger platform to artists practicing in a country that is, has a smaller population, that when it was created 22 years ago didn't have the strength of ecosystem that it has even today, and that really wasn't necessarily competing internationally or offering opportunities to artists from Canada internationally, the way that is improving through a lot of things. So, but at the end of the day, much like Ebony, I'm a capitalist, and I think that whether you become an artist or an investment banker, you should be able to save for your retirement, be rewarded for your work, and earn a competitive living. And
Well, we can look to, yeah, all right. Any politicians in the room listening? I've spent a lot of time in Ireland, and they, I think, they did have a pretty good system. I'm not sure at the moment what it is, but just in terms of tax law, etc., it was very pro arts and literature. So there's lots of room, I think, for reform here in that way, in terms of growing new art ecologies, because if we want to grow new art ecologies, we have to support artists. So, I mean, in the case of literature, it's a numbers game.
Sorry, before we change,
Yeah.
can I just ask
Sure.
Bernard a question too? Because I was of the mind for a long time, nobody get upset with me in Canada for this opinion, but there's a double-edged sword, I feel, with funding models
Right.
sometimes that are so generous, in that I myself have many close friends here in Canada who make a living, teach part-time, associate professors, have a studio, get funding. And there is something that, like an argument, or not an argument, but a discussion that happens with some of my Canadian expats in the United States and other continents even, that it's difficult because there's less funding, but what's at stake becomes different. I mean, I think it's fantastic that an artist gets a living wage. I agree it should be fair, but I know so many artists that will never, have never made something that is even close to a living wage through their art. So I think it's great that assistance is there, but then there becomes this I don't know, I don't have an answer. Is it better to know that you have the support in a way that is maybe not ever going to be as fair as it should be, but it's there? Or is it better to go, try to create a more fair wage, but you're in a country then that does not care whether you are receiving anything at all? Because I think that's what I've experienced in both working conditions here in Canada and the United States.
Right.
I mean, I was working under the table. I was doing lots of illegal things to try. There was no Canada Council ran out. I was no longer eligible after 2 years. It was I was not making a living wage. And it hurt. It was pretty hard.
Yeah.
And I remember, is there still that residency at the Gladstone or the Drake? And there's an artist who can live there essentially and work in the gets a hotel room for a year. I mean, I applied for it while I was in New York. I'm I need a place to live.
Right.
But so I'm not saying it's sink or swim, but there's just an interesting divide between.
Right.
To fund or not to fund, or how much, or living versus fair, and yeah.
And I think that kind of leads into my next question, which is, as we discussed earlier, talking about the difference in the American and Canadian experience in terms of private philanthropy versus state funding, and what role does the collector have in building new art ecologies?
100% of the role.
Okay.
I agree.
Collectors need to be reminded, especially in places like this art fair. So hopefully art fair administration is here. Collector development is the most important thing. True collectors need to understand that collecting means more than one. It means true artist support. It means gallery support. Support means money. When collectors come into my space and they're like, oh, we love what you do, 52 Walker is so great. I'm going to Instagram post this. I'm like, do you want to buy this?
Yeah.
This work on the wall is also for sale.
Right.
It's really important. I think there's some kind of disconnect between patronizing a space I don't need you to be a patron where you come in or talk about your support. This is P&Ls. This is profit and losses. This is supporting new commissions. If you like this new sculpture that this artist made, we had to use money to make it, and I don't want this artist to not be able to pay rent. I have a staff to pay. It's just there's some kind of disconnect, as though like writing about it or eventually buying a painting, and then you get to show your public collection and Architectural Digest. This happens all the time, but it's like, if you're a collector, you should have work from that artist from just out of grad school. Don't go into their studios in grad school and buy, also if you're a good collector, but out of grad school until they are finished making work. You should be a true patron and collector. And it's so important, and I feel like those conversations are not transparent enough. We don't need you to give money just to the museums for an acquisition board. Like, that's great, but the artist makes a fee of maybe $1,500, if anything. So keep the 30% discount or 40% that the museum gets, and now I'm getting really emotional. But give the money to the artists. That's what you're doing when you buy the work, and I think it's just not said out loud enough.
Yeah. Yes.
Money. We're in an art. Also here, this is an art. These are booths with things for sale. Like, we are in the space, and people are like, "Oh, would you like a glass of champagne?" I'm like, "Sure, but you should be getting me loose to spend money. Like, somebody should come and there should be credit card machines or conversations about invoices. We're not just walking around and talking. Come in early. My first art fair ever, a collector came in with a briefcase of cash. That was the good days. Those were the old.
Sounds like Iraq, Ebony.
I mean, it was, especially if you're in another country, the collector's like, "I'll give you $25,000 in cash here. When we get back to New York, I'll give you another 25." It's not like that right now, as everybody has felt, but it's about money. Like, I'm not fooling anyone by sitting up here and, "Oh, I have a Kunsthalle." It's like, no, I have art for sale.
Right.
I want an invoice. I want payment on time. All of that. It's important. Collectors. I'm going on a rant, but
Okay.
it's not talked about enough. Buy the work. That's how you support.
Drop the
Yeah.
money.
So I don't know,
Drop it.
Bernard, if you
Where's
had
the
anything
money?
to add to that, or
Well, what can you say after that? I mean, that was fantastic. Thank you.
We're capitalists,
We are.
clearly.
so the idea of literary patronage, speaking as a writer, it's great, but I think it's sort of an 18th century idea, sadly, that we should revive it. So I am just kind of fascinated, again, as a writer, about the difference between the literary and visual arts cultures, and I think it's just an interesting discussion to have, because it's illustrative, and it's talking about what is Canadian culture and how is it defined. And in the literary world, it's a numbers game. I mean, we need grants to write books because, my first book was a bestseller in Canada. It sold 8,000 copies because only 8,000 copies were printed. So most writers don't even earn out their royalties, So, earn out their advances. We don't get royalties. And I think there's this perception in other places that have larger populations that you can just make money, But obviously in the visual arts world, it's different. But I kind of want to get back to this idea about how the public and private funding issue influences ideas in the sort of national visual arts culture. Like, is there that sense that you're beholden to kind of create something that's Canadian, whatever that means, or to have a kind of national visual arts culture? Or is there more freedom in the visual arts world than in the literary, for instance? I mean, I had someone come up to me and say, "What, you got a grant from Canada Council to write a book about Iraq?" And I said, "Well, I was writing about the Canadian experience in Iraq," but there is this whole definitional issue. Maybe that doesn't exist at all in the visual arts culture nationally, but I'd like to know, does it?
Well, I'll speak from our experience at the Sobey Art Award. There are a number of people in the audience tonight who have been jurors and have participated in the process over the last 20 years. And really, they're the people who, from collecting institutions, I see Marc Longteau is here. Can you guys stand and be recognized? And Sarah Moore-Fillmore is here, and Ray Cronin is here. And am I missing anybody? I'm sorry. I can't, it's hard to say. Anyhow, so when, through our experience in that, it's really them in their institutions that have brought together what the Sobey Art Award has looked like for 22 years. We have a process that engages artists from all across the country. I swore that I wouldn't use the word regions, especially because this is Art Toronto. I and Rob Sobey, who's at the back of the room, are from Pictou County, Nova Scotia. And we have this thing where it's a region if it's not in Toronto, but it's in Canada.
Right.
So as opposed to being a country, we're all extensions of one city. So I won't use the word regional for that. Respectfully to all the Torontonians in the room,
Kind of an
of
internal
course.
colonialism.
Well, that's a whole other subject,
Okay.
Hadani. But really, I guess the point of all
It
of
is
that.
better than Montreal. Those who are from, look, if people are wide-eyed, it's a deep-seated rivalry. I'm making a joke.
And then, don't forget about Vancouver.
Yes,
Really
Vancouver is an
included.
interesting model because I think we have a very, very rich visual arts culture in terms of art makers, but perhaps not as much of a collectors community as we would like.
I just want to finish and say it's been
yes.
through all of the representatives of these institutions.
Right.
When you talk about a national vision, I think the most meaningful thing for me as an administrator over the years has been to see that the national vision is one of an extremity of diverse practices that are beautiful and compelling no matter where they are in the country.
Okay. Interesting. An extremity of diverse practices that are beautiful and compelling no matter where they are in the country. Wow. That's certainly an ideal to live up to. Yeah. So I was sort of segueing into Vancouver there, but we were talking a little bit just about getting back to the collector's role in creating new art ecologies. And in our discussion earlier, we were talking about Bob Rennie, who started his own museum and then donated it to the Chinese Canadian Museum. And of course, there's a connection to the Sobey finalist, Judy Chartrand, whose work Bob loaned to the National Gallery, etc. So I wonder if you could just talk a bit about that.
About
That connection to Judy's work and how
through
there was,
Bob?
just a sort of, and in terms of the way the collector has a role to play in fostering new art ecologies.
Yeah, well, Bob is a great example of this, and a great example for Canadian collectors. I mean, you can only say he's an incredible collector, not just of Canadian work, but of the work of artists from around the world. It's a vast collection. He's been doing it for a very long time. And in my experience, he's always been extremely generous with sharing it, not just across Canada, but anywhere where institutions want to show it. So.
Right, yeah. Well, the idea of collectors creating their own museums in Canada feels a little bit more like a novelty than it is in the States. I don't know, is that true, Ebony?
I think collectors like to think of their collections as museums. I mean, I think it's a difference of just the vocabulary. Some collectors have formidable collections as the Rennie collection, and they may not have brick and mortars, or they work towards something a bit more grand, but they some places, some collecting families have bigger foundations. There's the Rima Man Hort Foundation. There's a special building for that. I mean, I don't want to name them off, but I think it might be fair to say it's consistent. If you have a collection that's large enough to create something public, I think many collectors do.
Is it more of a model in the States for private collectors to start their own museums, do you think?
I don't know. Maybe more is difficult to qualify just based on the amount of collectors in the States are much more than Canada in terms of the quantities they collect. So more respectively to the amount of collectors, maybe not. Like, I don't think it's a regular thing for collectors to do, but there are more that exist. Yeah.
And of course, I forgot to mention Michael O'Dane. I think Curtis was here, the director of the O'Dane Museum. I don't know if he's here now, but another collector that started his own museum in Canada. So I am curious to know, I mean, the National Endowment for the Arts in the States does fund a very small percentage of arts and culture. I don't know what it is, but it's tiny, right? What's going to happen after the November election? And then also a lot of us are wondering about what's going to happen after our next federal election. And how can we as Canadians possibly learn from private patronage models in the States? I'd like to hear what both of you have to say on that.
You want to lead? You're there. So what can Canadians learn from private patronage in the States? Well, look, I think that there's look, I'm Canadian. All of my professional experience has been in Canada. I do think that I see, and it may be the size of the economy, but I do see a lot of a disproportionately higher amount of private generosity in the American system than I do in the Canadian system. I believe that there's a relationship between that, even on a proportional level, to the amount of state funding that's available in Canada versus the U.S. And the culture that has come out of that. I'm not sure if it's a good or a bad thing. I think there are considerations on both sides of that. But I do, you just sort of feel, especially when you're in cities like New York or Chicago, you feel the presence of private and family philanthropy in a very, very, very powerful way.
Yeah, it's visceral.
Now, there are extremely generous Canadians across the country. Are they just more Canadian and self-deprecating and less self-promotional than their American neighbors? Like, maybe that's it too. I don't know.
Possibly.
But there are very generous Canadians too. So.
Right, interesting.
And maybe that comes back a bit to what I was just reflecting on with Canada Council, or the support that exists here. Private funding, nothing would happen in New York without private funding.
Right.
Nothing on the scale with which we see it today. And I love Canada. I love what the Canadian art world does. I entered the art world here. I went to grad school at OCAD. But I think there is something to glean from the fact that some of us, I'll include myself in this reflection, think that a particular kind of experience can only be had outside of here. And don't shoot me for saying it. I'm just speaking about my own experience. But I intentionally chose an internship at a gallery in New York. At the time, I was expecting to return. I wanted to work in public art, but also the fact that my mind was not on commercial art here. I wanted to work on public commissions and public spaces in Toronto. I loved the idea of commissions, outdoor commissions, and really engaging communities. That's where my mind was. And I thought, why don't I just go over there and experience this thing to say I experienced it? And then I never left. But I didn't apply to a commercial gallery here.
Right.
And it really was not part of in my headspace at the time. And there are some amazing galleries who I now know much better professionally, and we work at art fairs together, and I see, but the mentality on the ground of somebody who was had not yet had professional practice at that level, it felt like I wanted to go where the private funding and commercial action was happening in my mind. I'm not saying that is true across the board, but
okay, interesting.
I do think it feels that way out of necessity in terms of private funding there.
Interesting. So, do you have something to add to that, Bernard?
No.
Okay. My question is, again, I guess a bit political, but if Trump wins the election and slashes the National Endowment for the Arts, will it make any difference? How will the cultural landscape shift if Poilievre wins and slashes the Canada Council that Conservatives have been promising to do for many years? Hopefully he won't. But just speculatively looking ahead, I'd like to get your take on that.
Ebony, do you want to lead on that one?
Sure, since you started the American one. I can propose what I hope happens, which is a survival mode where there are, like, some of my favorite collectors are in Canada. I mean, I'm here really because of these collectors. Not here in this fair, but I mean, I come back frequently because there is a vibrant and supportive community. But I'm hopeful that that community will step up more. I think then hopefully what will happen is it becomes seamless in terms of accessibility to funds. It'll just be coming from a different place. I hope that those collectors will understand their new role and less as a patronizing collector of a gallery and more of a real funder to subsidize cuts. I would expect that from them. And I think there are some really great collectors here, and maybe they just haven't been pushed in a direction where it felt like a need.
Okay. And Bernard, what say you?
Yeah, well, we're in a particular exercise right now, Hadani. The Sobey Art Foundation, a few years ago, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, received an open letter from a group of artists, largely based in Toronto, but that had signatories from across the country, many of whom had participated in our process. Because we made a decision, it was the first few months of the pandemic. We were looking at, doing the process of long listing and short listing artists and preparing for an event in Ottawa, not knowing, what the world was going to look like. So we just, I spoke to my board chair, and then he convened the board, and we decided to take the total prize purse and the associated costs, which are significant as well for the exhibition and all of those things, and divide it by the total number of artists on the long lists, and then just call it a day, to support people in being prepared. So in response to that, we got a letter that essentially encouraged us to give up an award model, to move to being more of a funder, like a public funder, and to figure out a way to, split funding up on what was, a more equal way. But the truth is we're private funders and we don't have the coffers of government. So we moved forward. We certainly adopted some of the recommendations they made in this letter around age limits, and it was all very sound advice. But this year, and for the last year, what we did was we went back to the initiators of that letter, and we hired them as consultants so that they were paid for their time to help us survey the landscape with their peers across the country around what a private foundation like the Sobey Art Foundation should be doing, for the next 25 years as a private funding body. That's the question that you asked about the future of the Canada Council and of public funding is top of mind in that process.
Right.
And it's not, the other thing is, I think it's very easy to say, to take a political party and say this will happen with them. But the truth is that when the cupboards are bare in the national coffers, it doesn't really matter which political party it is. The culture sector is always vulnerable to the whims of politicians.
Right.
And, I think a lot of people think, well, the further they are to the right on the spectrum, the more they're going to be anti-culture. But what really needs to be articulated to public officials is the value of cultural output for us all. Not just as something that we love, but what are the economics of it? What does it bring to municipalities? What does it bring, to the tax system? And we really need to get better at all of that. So
why don't, in France and Ireland, people don't have those discussions. It's interesting that we have to sort of prove our worth, but maybe we do. My last question, are we okay for time? Okay, great. Unless, I don't know if you had anything to add to that. Didn't want to. Okay, great. So, And this is maybe a chance for both of you to talk about individual artists that you're working with, and especially about the Sobey finalists, perhaps. I mean, in terms of growing art ecologies and the role of the gallery and the art museum, I'm really interested in looking at this sort of global trend at the moment for censoring artists who are working around politically sensitive topics. And I'm thinking about two stories I did in the last year for the art newspaper here in Toronto at the local level. One was about Wanda Nanabush and her departure from the AGO. Supposedly because of certain views she had. And another story I did on the Palestinian American artists who were censored at the ROMS exhibition on death and dying rituals. In the art newspaper a few days ago, a colleague of mine had a kind of more positive model story, I guess, about the mosaic rooms in London, which during the past year, this gallery space has become a real refuge and a haven for Palestinian artists in the diaspora and those fleeing Palestine. So in that context, I'm really keen to know what role you see the art museum and the gallery have in fostering new ecologies, especially for marginalized communities.
What role we have to foster marginalized economies? Is the question?
No, just in terms of the examples I gave about this sort of unfortunate global trend towards censorship of artists who are dealing with politically sensitive issues, whether it's a global indigeneity or what's going on in Gaza. What role does the art museum have, or the gallery have, as in the example of the mosaic rooms in London, which has actually become an incubator of art and a sanctuary for a lot of Palestinian artists in the diaspora? I'm just interested in hearing from both of you about how the gallery can play a role in nurturing artists from marginalized communities.
I think that as the most marginalized person in a commercial art gallery in New York, there's no black people in art galleries. I've said it out loud. I'm saying it with a smile on my face because we have to. I mean, what's happening now is not new. It happened in the 90s and identity politics, and it happened in the 80s and Reagan, and it happened with Vietnam and Adrian Piper. Like, we've had artists who've been speaking on political strife and marginalized communities, censored voices. I'm currently the editor in residence for Topical Cream, and my entire prompt was about censorship. Shout out Sarah in the room, who wrote a fantastic piece.
Yay.
And it was a loose prompt, but I think that our role is one that has always existed, in my opinion, and it's at its core, is reliant upon those bodies and characters and ideologies of the people running those spaces. Mm-hmm. So I would question the kind of structures that are in place to choose the leaders of those institutions, rather than what the walls are intended to do. I think that power is not actually on the wall as it should be in many instances. But, there are people and tables with chairs around it of those who become the deciders of things. And I think, to answer your question first more bluntly, art galleries and museums were created to steward voices,
right,
marginal or not. It's art. People who become artists are not accountants for a reason. They have the most creative, annoyingly, I work with artists so closely, so I'm just being candid, but it's hard to manage artists. Y'all are crazy, It's like, I think I want to, I'm a painter, but I'm going to make a video for the first time. Can we do it? And I'm like, I guess, But that's why, so artists, the spaces that we are in, that's what we do. So I think the bigger question is not for people like myself or Bernard, but when there is the feeling that there's censorship, where is it coming from? Because that's not what those spaces were built for.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. And your own gallery, if I understand correctly, has an all-black staff, but the work you show is from everywhere. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
So, and it's sort of a
just an example of, I am at the helm of this space.
Right.
what does my personal constitution or my set of ideological guidelines that I've, are constantly evolving, what is important to me?
Right.
That's important to me. I've never had a black boss in the art world. At OCAD, there was no black professors at the time. I was advised to get 2 externals. Just pause for a moment. Nobody understands, 2 external advisors that both had, were encouraged to be black. I mean, it's fine. You take it, you have to pretend to eat shit and not care that it tastes like shit. But then when you're in a moment where you can do something different, I think that's the question. It's like an art space is to allow for voices. What did I want to do? Hire people who look like me. Do I only show black art? No. There's a lot of black art I don't like. There's a lot of white and brown and yellow. I mean, I don't. Right. It's not a. We're not all cut from this cloth that you need to love. I'm going on a tangent, but it's really important to talk about. I was once asked to review a show at the AGO of a black woman artist, figurative work. I'm going to leave names out just to be a little discreet. And and I was at a place in my career I really thought I was going to be a fantastic writer, until I realized how hard it is to make a fair wage as a writer. You can maybe make a living wage, but I didn't like the work. Nothing I'd ever written about or proposed on my own would have any indication that I would be an advocate for this work, except that I'm a black woman. And I told the curator, I was like, hey, I really appreciate the query, but I don't think I'm the right person. You know what they said? Well, maybe that would be an interesting entry point, still trying to make it work. I was like, I think it's a bad artist, if you want me to be blunt. So I'm just saying I'm not even saying I wanted to talk about this for a long time, about this show at the AGO. But I'm at the helm. I'm choosing to do this, to give people credit who have hired me. They've trusted me to make those decisions. Yeah. And so I'm giving voices and space for those that I choose. Everyone who's at the helm and has the ability to make those decisions should. Yeah. If you see censorship happening, there is an individual, there is a person, not a building behind it.
Right. Wonderful. Shout out, by the way, to Bland Gallery, to Josephine, who is one of the galleries that's in my art newspaper story that I filed before coming here about this wonderful art fair. And some of these questions are in the story, too. And by the way, I can really relate to your sort of shoehorning experience. It was like when I was on national radio live when my first book came out, Dancing in the No-Fly Zone, and this lovely older white gentleman asked me, so how does it feel to be an Iraqi Kurdish woman refugee living in Canada? And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know, because I'm not one. But anyway, nuance. So, Bernard, I'm sure you have a lot to share about what the Sobey Foundation is doing in this regard in terms of nurturing new art ecologies and marginalized communities and...
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I'm going to go back to I'm just going to continue on here. All right. I have an idea. If institutional censorship is, a top of mind, highly problematic thing, if we have more independent private philanthropy, we can have more independent private philanthropists funding institutions to be bold and take risks and give voices to people. And I would encourage everyone who has the capacity to do that and to commit your resources to cultural programming, not just institution building, but also ecosystem building, because you can't have healthy institutions without a healthy ecosystem, and vice versa. I've really been blessed with a board I'm going to call out my friend and the vice chair of the Sobey Art Foundation.
You're calling out everyone in this audience.
Well, it's Canada. It's a small country.
Right, okay,
Del Pullman from Calgary, Alberta is over here, and he's the vice chair of the Sobey Art Foundation board. And Jonathan Shaughnessy is the chair of the Sobey Art Award.
Stand up, Jonathan.
He's right there.
Yay, Jonathan.
So, yeah, I would say that, look, and to the overall theme of today's talk, around fostering ecosystems, just more programming philanthropy is really going to help, and you get a tax receipt. So go for it. We're lucky that we get to work with the National Gallery. We've partnered with over 8 institutions since this project was initiated. Right. But there are institutions like large and small all across the country. And if you have the capacity, go to them and say, like, I want to help you help artists of all kinds. And if you've got any guts, leverage your capacity to tell them to empower those artists, no matter who they are.
What a brilliant way to tie in all these themes we've been discussing. So one opportunity for overcoming censorship at an institutional level, then, as you're suggesting, is increasing private philanthropy and also partnerships, I heard, too, an important way that we're going to all have to band together to survive in these coming dark days, but hopefully not.
Not any darker than the last 65 years.
Exactly. Thanks for pointing that out earlier. That was great. So are we at the question moment, Emily, I think? And by the way, since everyone's shouting out people, is Donald Schmidt the architect here? Did Donald come? No? Don? No. He was supposed to come, but he's designing the new gallery for band. Okay, so take it away, I guess. Is there anyone here that has questions? Oh, yes, this gentleman.
Hi, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much for giving such a great talk. So a lot of the trends of what I'm hearing as well is you mentioned about Canada being a small country and your desire to go to a commercial...
Speaking to me?
Yeah,
okay,
go to a commercial gallery in the United States. And this just reminds me, I took my partner to go to a show at Jane Corkin, the Riopel show. And during the biography, it spoke about all the museums that Riopel had been to, the Venice Biennale, and the last entry was the Canadian museums that he was a part of. So I wanted to know if there was a way for us to bring the Canadian institutions to be more prominent on the international stage.
Interesting question, but I just want to say selfishly, I didn't say Canada was a small country. I think it's a very big and beautiful, resourceful country full of opportunity, but I know what you mean. I think, I'm being really honest here, I don't have the same feeling about Canadian institutions, if that helps at all. I mean, for example, if I'm doing what happens a little behind the scenes for 52 Walker, I brought photos for people. I'm not sure if they're going up, but I just brought some. You can see some of the shows I've done. 2 of the images. So that's Tao Lewis, who is a Canadian artist from Toronto, actually. So, for example, with Tao, I'll propose the show and I work on something with this artist, and then I present it to my colleagues. And I do this very thing where I say, this kind of provenance, images of other shows. And I'm just speaking from my own experience, but I will prominently list National Gallery of Canada. In my, Sarah Swinar is also a photo here. This is my current show with Sarah, who's amazing, one of my favorite artists. I did a show 10 years ago, her first solo. I'm working on a solo now. But one of my kind of pitch things are like National Gallery of Canada acquired Glass Life, her major film, and up until this one, it's up on view. I personally, I hear what you're saying, and maybe that is a question for internally in Canada for maybe not prioritizing their own institutions here and thinking, let me list the Whitney first, But I used it in my promo. I'm like, it's up at the National Gallery of Canada. You can see it if you go by. So maybe it's a question internally, but I don't see it on the other side. I promote Canada all the time.
Okay, and we have another, I don't know, Bernard, did you have anything to add to that? No? Okay. Yes? No. Here's a question. Someone who knows you.
Most Canadian museums, pardon me while I read because I was scribbling it down, most Canadian museums are struggling with acquisition budgets. Can you comment how these institutions can engage with collectors to encourage donations of whole or parts of their collection rather than selling those works back into the market? And I ask this because it seems to me that most Canadian museums seem to be too polite, reluctant, embarrassed, shy, whatever, to outright ask for those desired works from those collections.
Can I start on this one? So it was mentioned at the end of my bio that I'm going into a new role as the CEO of the Beaverbrook Art Gallery in Fredericton. The chair of my board, Jamie Irving, is at the back of the room, and I've observed this Dell. And I intend to be utterly shameless with a lot of the people in the room and a lot of people at the fair about their collections to help strengthen that institutions.
And I will add that it's a hard job. Director of a museum, I'm not giving them all passes, but I've been offered a position that it was at the helm of a museum. And to be frank, the reason I couldn't even fathom considering it is I would fail as a fundraiser. I mean, it's such a particular. It's also the work. It's actually quite a lot of strategy. I mean, you have to build your own network. You have to build your own ecology to support that space. I personally feel like I'm afraid of it, and I'm just trying to point that out to say it's a difficult task to secure those funds. Even if the funds are there, we've talked about how funds exist in various ways. I'm saying, you have money buy the art. If you have money support boards and other kinds of institutions, other kinds of spaces to see what you want to have happen. But it's much easier to say that than to actually have someone give you that money. And I think it's just a change in the mentality of the people with the money. I don't have money, so I'm not sure. But I mean, if people who have the funds to support understood how important, which is what I was saying earlier, if there was more of a shift in driving that home to collectors, what it truly means to patronize is not just showing up. That's right. It's really money. And let's just, like you said, stop being polite about it. Spend the money on the things. I'm not a great salesperson. Also, I pitched 52 Walker so I wouldn't have to sell. I ended up being the main salesperson of the space, but I don't do art fairs. I like art fairs, of course, we're here, but it's hard. Selling is hard, guys. It's a hard sell to get someone to believe in the work the way you do all the time.
There is one other point that I want to just make to Dell's question, and that's that, I think that when it comes to people who are very committed collectors, it's a passion. It's a private passion. It's a personal passion. You're doing it with your own resources, presumably for your own home. But institutions should be more aligned with the fact that if you do that, like if it's part of your values to use your resources to buy cultural products, then you're likely going to be the kind of person who wants to share that with communities, right? So just institutions should just keep asking.
Okay, do we have time for more questions? Yes, one more? This lady here, yes.
Thank you, Hadani, for the constant shout out for our little band gallery. Bless you.
Thank you, and I'd love it if people would introduce themselves.
Karen Carter, co-founder of Band Gallery, Black Artists Networks in Dialogue. I'm sitting beside my colleague, director extraordinaire, who you've had the pleasure of hanging with, Josephine Denis, that's kind of knocked it out of the park with our first showing at Art Toronto. And I guess I want to thank Art Toronto for making it accessible for a little gallery like us to be present. My question is connected to two things your panelists have been discussing, and that is about leadership and the arts ecosystem. And because of the size and the space band sits in this country, as frankly the only Black gallery focused on contemporary art practice for Black cultural practitioners in this country and globally, we're consciously aware of that middle. And I think when I sit in rooms like this and people are talking about acquisitions and money and institutions, I think for us, the stuff that's really interesting that's happening in Canada is actually in that mushy middle and at the grassroots. And I wonder about the interest in cultivating what some may call a pipeline. And for us, it's more about the ecosystem, because I don't think everyone has to want to become an AGO. Band is lucky enough to own a little Victorian house, as you mentioned, that we're renovating. We don't want that to grow into the AGO. If you live in the city, you know the little house that faces the park that was the start of the AGO. We like our little space and the flexibility it gives us, but you have to wonder, are the business and cultural leaders, the people who sit on the boards of the institutions and the foundations in this country, are they interested in that pipeline? Are they interested in that ecosystem? And do they understand the importance of their support at that level, and how, frankly, what very little could do to have a really big impact on the cultural landscape of this country? Because I think those of us who've come of age here, as again so eloquently stated by Ebony, this conversation around activism, diversity, cultural representation in Canada, multiculturalism, isn't a new one. But I think those of us who are figuring out how to navigate space, we're looking around going, where's the money? And if it does show up, it usually is showing up in weird ways where you're like, can I take that money? Because it might be more work than it's worth, because people are not thinking about how that little bit helps to really cultivate a strong cultural ecosystem, which frankly means you're seeding the next wave of leaders. And that's, for me, it's like that connection between cultural ecosystem to ensure you have another wave of leadership for another 100 years for this country. So, sorry, long rant, but hopefully they can comment on that.
Interesting, the connection between seeding small artist-run galleries and the larger institutions and the future of art in Canada. Take it away.
First of all, thank you for the question. I guess, I approach this from the perspective of a person who has worked with a foundation that has typically worked with larger institutions. But in the portfolio of philanthropy that the Sobey family, sort of represents, we distinguish decidedly between the activities of the Sobey Art Foundation and then all of the other family foundations, simply because we are, artist-centric, right? I've seen, and we're Maritimers, like we're from Nova Scotia, and I'm from New Brunswick, but the Sobeys are from Nova Scotia. So when it comes to, the smaller organizations within multiple ecosystems, frankly, I've been very blessed to work with people who understand the importance of that, because we're from a town of 4,000 people. Where things started that became really important. So I've been really lucky to work with funders who see that, and it's not it doesn't. I mean, we're at an art fair, so Cape Breton, right? So one of my favorite examples of investment in something, like when you're comparing to large scale investments. What does seed money do? And a request had come in from an organization. It was a shelter in Cape Breton, in rural Cape Breton. The investment was a very small one compared to the other multi-million-dollar asks that were in from universities and hospitals. And for years, for a $50,000 initial investment, again, I'm sorry for not talking about art, but it speaks to the point of, quantum versus intention and strategy, if I understood the question properly. For years, I saw letters from people whose lives were impacted, they're largely women and their children, whose lives were impacted because that shelter in, what is a very small town in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, saved their lives. That's worth, those letters are worth more to the world than major investments in cancer research that may have been made because, well, for obvious reasons, I guess. So I'm sorry I don't have a cultural example, but that's from a funding perspective.
I'm not sure which point to reflect on here, to be honest. Like, you mean how to grapple with culturally funding spaces that are more marginal? Oh, the benefit. How to communicate the benefit of that. I got you. When someone finds out, they should tell me. I don't know, to be honest, and I think that's a sad but very honest answer. I think there's this, I grapple with it to this day. I mean, you can come into 52 Walker and there'll be a price list. Legally in the state of New York, if you are a commercial business, you have to have a price list at the front desk. I share previews. I work as a senior director of one of the largest blue chip galleries, and I do work those art fairs for them sometimes. Okay, I'll be at Miami Basel with David Zwirner, but I am a commercial director. But there's something about the space having black people at the front desk and me the only person in the office that connotes this falsity of DIY and nonprofit. But that's not my problem. I mean, I don't know. I have to have a thick skin already, and people make assumptions that are, racist stereotypes that I think are going to be impossible to change in my own lifetime. So I hope that by hiring people who look like me and sending them out into the world to try and change it internally, it's like we have to infiltrate to change the mentality. Otherwise, it's often looked upon as artist-run space, nonprofit space. Oh, this show is for sale? Oh, you're showing a white male artist? I thought this was only black things, or like something really ignorant. But I think it's important to talk about it and keep pushing, and those people who sit at tables and make decisions like that color coding needs to change. Change needs to come from top down, internally top and down. Otherwise, the message doesn't really get across. I mean, it literally says in the New York Times, the program is not all black. And Roberta Smith wrote in the New York Times a space that shows lesser known and new emerging black voices. And I called Roberta Smith. And I was like, that's factually wrong. There has to be a retraction. It's just like something, and I love Roberta. It's not a ragging on anybody, but I'm just saying that assumption just comes out, and it's steeped in a history of cultural racism. It's like, there's a DEI officers in museums are not going to change a history of exclusion.
I have to respond as a writer with a solution about how to communicate the importance that you're making in your point about the connection between fostering new art ecologies in marginalized communities and institutions in the larger scene. Well, one way is to, hire writers to tell your stories and write books about them and do articles, because there's hardly any arts journalism left in the world, but in Canada there's hardly any. And it's important to get the stories out there, I think. I just have to put a shout out for my oppressed cultural journalist comrades, because that really is an issue. Are we telling the stories that are important in Canada? And how can we tell those stories about art ecologies if there's really no journalism per se left? So I think we have to look at alternate models for communicating what's going on in the art scene here. My 2 cents worth. So, Emily, are we at time? I would just like to again thank our wonderful panelists here, Bernard and Ebony. And I would like to thank Art Toronto and Emily Butler, who's curating these wonderful platform talks, for inviting me to come here from Vancouver. It's my first time at Art Toronto, and I got the opportunity to meet some lovely people, including these two wonderful panelists. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Art Toronto.